How long does it take to buy a home? Common question, right? Here's the long answer. Watch the video. Hi, I'm Amol Heda with Keller Williams Bay Estates and author of Thriving Through Ownership. Welcome back to my channel. Today, we are going to discuss how long does it take to buy a home. A totally different question if you were to ask me, how long does it take to close a property once you get in contract? That's pretty determined. But how long does it take to buy a home? Depends on several factors. And let's go through it. Number one, let me first give you the statistics. I have closed about 3 to 5 buyers only in my 2 decades of practice. The first week, I first do the counseling session with my clients, give them a full understanding of how to play the real estate play, and then we go out in the field to show them properties. Guess what? I have closed about 5 to 6 buyers only. Counseled them this week. We went to see a property next week. We saw a few of whatever based on their target, and we immediately got into contract and closed in 30 days or whatever it took just from getting that into contract and closing. So the least amount of time that I have been able to help my clients by is about 40 days from counseling to closing, get their keys and move into their home. Now, what is the longest? I started with one of my clients in 2013, I would say, and I just closed them now, 2023. So 10 years, that has been my longest. So guess what happened? These clients, their initial starting budget was 650 to 700 max. When they just closed, we closed in at 1.8 million. 2013 was the bottom of the market, or just getting off of the bottom. And no one was sure whether the bottom is done yet. And so my clients started working with me at that time. And I started showing them properties. They started liking some, rejecting some, and the process goes on. We did like a couple, we wrote an offer. Somewhere we even got accepted, but they afterwards didn't think that that would work for them. And so we kept on doing this thing, and to the point that they were so serious and so committed to working with me that they decided that they should just call me as and when they like a property, because they had done at least 30 or 50 properties going with me to understand what I will approve for them or what will work for them and not, because I keep giving a very deep insight working with my clients and showing them properties, what will work for them and what will not work for them. So they had gone to the point where they would just call me only if they liked a property after full screening. And that's where we finally were able to close that in 10 years. I'm so thankful and blessed that they still trusted me and decided to work with me. So that's that. Now, let's get down to the other question. How much time does it take to close a property once we get it, write an offer and get it accepted? So that's a much more concrete process. Once you offer on a property and it gets accepted, you typically take about 30 days. And again here, the answer is, it depends. Because sometimes the seller is not ready to move. Sometimes the buyer does not have the right timeline to do it. So sometimes we write a 60-day purchase contract. If it is a more complex transaction, more complex property, we write 90 days. But for most part, residential transactions, here in California, in the hottest market, close between 30 and 60 days from the date you accept to the date you close. What goes on here? So you divide this transaction, the 30-day period. For now, we'll just work with the 30-day period because that's very common and that's where most of the transactions will typically settle in. So there are 3 phases in these 30 days to the transaction. The first phase is the contingency period. What? Contingencies? Do people even accept offers with contingencies? Most likely not. Particularly here in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley market, contingencies is almost a no-no. But there have been situations, and with the market being where it is, with the kind of interest rate that we are seeing, contingencies are coming back into play. Talk to your agent to understand if it is wise to write a contingency or not. Because when you write contingencies, fewer people will accept your offer. If you write contingencies, they don't want to work with you because it's difficult. Even if they don't have an offer, they'll wait for that offer where it is non-contingent. And sometimes the non-contingent offers or the full cash offers, they come in at a lower price. So buyers sometimes get a much better price negotiation when they go with non-contingent offer. And that's part of the reason non-contingent offers are very popular. So, but if you have contingencies, typically for me, we typically have 3 contingencies or 4 for that matter to be able to back out of the transaction without hurting the buyer's deposit. Now, what does that mean to the seller? The seller will get hurt because the seller is holding the property off of the market in thinking that you're going to buy, the buyer, and the buyer at this point has the right to buy. The buyer with a contingent offer is not committed to buying. They are doing investigations, property condition, appraisal, loan, and in some rare cases, if they have their current property, they put a contingency on the sale of the buyer's property. And then there is that one odd one, which is the sellers. The sellers could say, oh, until we find our replacement property, we are not going to complete this transaction. So guess, there are these 4 reasons or contingencies that the buyer and the seller could agree not to complete the transaction. And so when you get into contract with one of these 4 contingencies, the buyer has the right to hold the property. The seller cannot sell it to any other buyer and keeps that property off the market. And this buyer will then have the right to do the due diligence in the period. And the typical periods that I use in this case are 5 days to 7 days at the most for inspections. Appraisal comes about 7 to 10 days. And once the appraisal is in, it might take another 2 or 3 days to get the final approval. So all these happen in parallel. Now, if the transaction is contingent on sale of the current home of the buyers, then that's another story. And if the home does not sell for 90 days, this transaction is not closing for 90 days. And that puts a whole issue on the entire transaction. And that's why those offers are very unpopular. So that's that. So I literally use a joke. You know, it's very popular that it's pretty common that people don't disclose that they're pregnant, bearing a child until the first trimester. And so I also joke with my clients and I say, hey, do not disclose to anybody that you are buying a property in this period, the first 10 to 14 day period, while your contingencies are being worked on, that you're buying a property. Because you're not really buying the property. You went and put the deposit and put a hold on the property so that the seller cannot sell. But at the same time, you have no commitment to buy the property unless all of these things work out. So there's no point telling people, oh, I'm buying a property, because you're not buying the property. You are just doing due diligence. And that's the first trimester rule. And so that's your first third. The second third, the next 10 days of the transaction, is where most of the loan action takes place. Before you get into transaction, you typically get something called as a pre-approval. In rare cases, people get a pre-qualification. And then there are very rare cases when people start with an underwriting approval. So pre-qualification is as good as almost a blank paper. Lots of times that pre-qualification does not go into as much of a detail as an underwriter would go to approve your mortgage. Pre-approval, on the other hand, takes the credit score, your down payment funds, your reserves, your income, everything into consideration, and it's almost ready. But still, there is things like employment verification and other things. Talk to the lender and they will explain what all remains after doing a pre-approval. On the contrary, if you get an underwriting approval, the underwriting approval has completed the entire process of loan approval, and all it waits for is the appraisal to come in. If you have an underwriting approval, you can write a non-contingent offer on loan, because that process, the second and the third half of the purchase transaction process, is already completed. And if that part of the process is completed, you don't need to say you have a contingent offer on loan getting approved. All you need to do is technically have the appraisal approved, and that's it. So that's the second part. So the underwriter takes the file, it goes into the bank's underwriter, who checks that all the conditions or guidelines that the bank has to get this mortgage approved are followed. And if they are followed, then the underwriter says okay to go, and they will clear the file. But if they don't clear the file and they think there are some conditions, like you moved $50,000 from one account to the other, or you deposited some cash into the accounts, they need to know everything about this. So even when the underwriter gives that approval, you typically get conditional approval, not a final approval. And here you will get conditions that this buyer needs to meet in order to get fully approved. So that's your second part. And typically this takes about 10 to 12 days from the date, the previous 2 to 3 days from the appraisal. It could sometimes extend more, because if there is a lot that the buyer needs to provide, a lot needs to come back to the underwriter, and the underwriter needs to verify what needs to happen, all the things that need to happen, and tie the loose ends. So that's what it is. And in the last 5 days, once this approval is all done, in the last 5 days, the lender's closing team takes over from the underwriter. The file goes from the underwriter to the closing team, and they start drawing up the documents, sending these documents to the title company. The title company and the closing department work together to arrive at an agreeable number, because ultimately the bank is going to get paid and multiple properties are going to get paid, and the lender needs to know who is going to get paid and how. And so the underwriter, and where is that money coming from? So the underwriter gets all these details working with the title company, and they draw up something called as the closing statement or closing cost statement. According to the new law from the CFPB, they call the document that comes out of this process as the closing disclosure. And this closing disclosure needs to come at least 3 days before the actual close happens in the county. And so this closing disclosure needs to be looked at by the buyer, and the buyer needs to approve. If the buyer doesn't approve, they can still back out of the loan. I don't know who is going to provide a loan in 3 days unless they have full cash. But they have the right to back out at that point, and that is why that period of 3 days. If they approve, the title draws the closing statement, gives them the closing cost. If they are fine with the closing cost estimate, the buyers are to sign all the terms and conditions of the lenders, all the escrow and title documents, and these go, once they are signed, they go back to the title company. The title sends the required documents to the lender. If the lender approves, the lender puts their money after the buyer has put their remaining money. And once the buyer has put the money, the lender sends their money to the title company. The complete money is there, and once that money is there, the title sends the transaction for recording in the county, telling the county that everything is good. So this is your 30-day process. Now, it could become 45, it could become 60. The moment you increase the number of days to close a transaction, the loan becomes more fluid, and so the lender usually charges higher interest rate when they have to lock it for anything more than 30 days. So the rates are generally higher. Talk to your lender when you are trying to do longer transactions in this. So these are the components. And then once the county records the property in the buyer's name, the title tells the agent, and the agents then exchange the keys, and the key is then delivered to the buyer. And hey, that's your close. So this is not just this video didn't turn out to be just how many days does it take to close. This video became what's the overall process closing and how much period does it take for closing. So I hope you now understand in detail the closing process goes. I'll delve deeper into these steps or expand on how these things happen more depending on your comments to this video. So if you have any questions, feel free to put comments here, ask those questions below, and I'm happy to answer those. Thank you for spending the time. Thanks for watching. Talk to you in my next one. Bye.